But if you think it's worth your time and it gives you a level of comfort that you wouldn't have otherwise, I think you do it. But eventually you're going to get to the place where some people are going to say no, and it doesn't mean they wouldn't be good fits. Podcast Growth Nation, welcome back to another episode of Podcast Growth University, where we talk all things podcasting all the time. I hope you enjoyed the previous episode. It was episode number 91. Should your podcast have a Facebook page? I also talked a lot about Facebook, and I was talking to a client the other day, and they said it's very similar to the way they're experiencing it. Facebook is becoming one of their top platforms. So again, you never know. Testing it out is probably worth doing if you're not doing it yet. Today, for episode number 92, this is the episode that I've been pushing off for a couple weeks, but I think now is the time to do it. Probably be a quick one, probably be an easy one, but I want to touch on it. So for episode number 92, we're going to talk about, should you do pre-calls before guest interviews? So at this point, you might be sick of hearing it or me saying it. I'm not saying it to brag, just so I can talk from a place of experience, not guessing or theory. I have been on close to probably 800 other podcasts at this point over the last 7 years. And I would say, I don't know, maybe 25% of them have done podcast pre-calls. And this is my thought. So this is coming from somebody who, as a podcast host, never did a pre-call. Did I regret that sometimes? Yes. Full transparency. We had guests on that never saw the light of day. Right after the interview was done, we said that's not aligned with our audience, and then we ended up canning it. So take that as an experience. Hopefully you don't have that same experience. But I've also been on the other end where I probably didn't need a pre-call for the certain level of guests that we were having. So here's really my new perspective. It's changed a lot. You can probably get a really good idea about somebody by going through their social media, by listening to other podcasts they've been on, by seeing if they have a podcast and listening to their podcast. You can probably get a really good understanding of who they are, the way they speak, whether or not they vibe with what you're trying to do, whether or not they're aligned, that type of stuff, rather than spending a half hour on a call with them or 15 minutes on a call with them. And here's why. The majority of the time when I'm on a show for a pre-call, they just say, okay, tell me a little bit about yourself, tell me what you want to talk about, and then we'll kind of take it from there. With all the love and the all due respect, they could very easily figure out my story by listening to any other podcast, and or what I want to talk about by listening to ours. I'm not saying it's lazy. I'm not saying anything bad about having pre-calls, but you could probably save yourself and the person that you're having on a lot of time by just doing extra layers of research. And here's why. Eventually, if you're trying to get higher level guests and higher level guests, eventually you're going to get to the place where people don't do pre-calls. We had some very large guests on. It's hard enough for them to block off a half hour or an hour for an interview. It's going to be really hard for them to block off 15 minutes or a half hour to do a podcast pre-call. At that point, it's our job to research them and make sure that they are aligned as guests. And that's still my belief. I think as the host, it's our job, it's our responsibility to do as much research as humanly possible. I really think that is something that we're kind of missing out on now, because it's easier than ever to get guests. It's easier than ever to get on shows, but it doesn't mean your prep should be any different. And it doesn't mean you can't impress people by really knowing who they are. Some of my favorite shows I've ever been on, they did a lot of research and there was no pre-call. And we got along just fine because they researched me and they kind of understood what I was doing in the world and my story. And here's the other thing. I research the shows that I go on before I go on as well. So that's something that's helpful. I can't promise your guest is going to do that. They might not. It might just end up on their calendar and they might just show up. I don't know. I like to know what I'm in for. I like to listen to a little bit of an episode. I like to know the host's name. Sometimes it might be a more complicated name than Mike or Joe or Brittany. So I like to listen and hear them pronounce it so I know how to address them. Sometimes I'm not able to do that, so I have to ask them how to pronounce their name. But I just think that there's a lot of stuff out there on social media, and if you can do a really good job in the searching phase, in the getting to know them phase, in the framing your questions, like that type of stuff, you probably don't need the pre-call. You probably don't need it. Now, if you come across someone who you can't find anything about online, none of that, then that's a different story. But now, even if somebody has a very small following, they tend to have some level of social media. And again, maybe that's short-sighted, because maybe you're somebody who's older and you're interviewing people who are older and they don't necessarily have social media. So that is a fair point when it comes to that. But I just know that as a system, it's probably going to make things more challenging as you evolve into bigger and bigger guests. So that is one of the reasons I wanted to touch on it. And I think for a lot of us, it can be a safety net. A safety net of, well, if I know this person and I know exactly what they want to talk about, I can go in prepped. I love that. I'm all for prep. I love over prepping. But I do think that it could be a bottleneck eventually. And again, I've mentioned this in the past. Just make sure you know the guest's name. I was on a show recently and they kept mispronouncing my name over and over and over. And it's not hard. Again, it's not a super hard name. And I've mispronounced names too. But that was more from a place of nervousness, not knowing the person's name. So you got to get that right. If you get that wrong, you're going to lose all credibility, not only with the person that you have on, but with your audience. If you have someone on, so just as an example, if I'm on a podcast and they say, so my name is Kevin, for all of Kelvin's links and what he's doing in the world and his podcast and all that, click the link in the show notes. And somebody goes and clicks the link and they see that my name is Kevin and it's plastered all over the place, you might lose credibility with your audience. And that's not a good look. It's not a very good look at all. Your job as a host is to make your guests look good, and it's to make yourself look good. And it's to obviously provide a quality experience for whoever's watching and or listening. So I think it can be valuable in the very beginning, but I think that when you get to a certain point, it might just be more time than it's worth. If you're only going to have a 10 to 15 minute meeting and it's just, okay, tell me about yourself, tell me about your story. What do you want to talk about? Are there any no-fly zones? When can you book? Those could all be figured out in a couple ways. One, you could have a questionnaire that gets sent to anybody who's interested in being on the show, and they have to fill it out before you book. It can have your calendar right in it. Maybe I'll do an episode on that in the future too, like how to streamline the process, because I don't talk about that often, and I do know that's super valuable. So let me make a quick note. We'll do it live. Streamlining processes, we'll call it. Okay. So you could probably get away with just doing that. In the beginning, sure, it's awesome. Build up some comfort, build up some certainty, build up the process. Awesome. But I think eventually you can probably just do either an onboarding sheet where it says, what's your name? What's your experience? What are the things you like to talk about? This is my suggestion. Don't use the questions on Podmatch or Matchmaker. So two very good platforms to get guests and or get on other shows, Podmatch, Matchmaker. I have no affiliation with either of them. I'm not getting paid to say that. They've just been really, really helpful. But on those platforms, there's a section where it says, write down 5 to 10 questions that you like getting asked. When I did that, I thought that was 5 to 10 questions that people would use as inspiration to ask other questions, but I've had people just go down the list and say, why is consistency important and all that? Again, I'm all for it, but I wouldn't necessarily bet on that podcaster to win long term, because that doesn't make for a great interview. It's hard to piece together questions that aren't necessarily related, and there's no small talk in between. There's no pulling of the string, as you've heard me talk about before.
I just wanted to take a quick second and give a shout out and a huge thank you to Next Level Podcasting Solutions, Kevin and his team. They have been incredible to work with, very flexible, on the spot with any questions that I have or any concerns that I have. When I first started out my podcast, I was doing everything on my own. I have no editing background. I have no podcasting background. I knew nothing about it. And so I was bootstrapping all of this myself while I was still trying to take on my role as a full-time mom. And once I met up with Kevin and we had these discussions and I got on board with adding an editing team, oh my goodness, it just lifted this weight off of me. It lifted my time that I was spending doing my editing. And in the beginning, full transparency, when I was editing just my individual recordings, it was a little more manageable, not super manageable. And then when I started doing my interviews for the podcast, it was hours upon hours of me doing the editing that didn't include any of the promotional material that I am now getting from Kevin and his team. It wouldn't have been sustainable. I would not have been able to keep up with that. So I recommend Kevin and his team. They have done wonderful work in helping me grow my podcast. I have really enjoyed working with the editing team, and it definitely feels like more of a team environment versus me hiring them to do a specific job. I mean, we all work collaboratively on the projects that I have, and I have these crazy ideas sometimes, and they come up with a solution to fit my needs. I can't recommend them enough. I've really enjoyed working with them. Kevin and the Next Level Podcasting Solutions, thank you so much for the work that you have done in the past and are continuing to do for me. I'm growing this community and growing this platform with a beautiful team that is working for me and with me to see my vision and help that come to life. So thank you again so much. I really appreciate you guys.
So for goodness sake, don't just use the questions somebody sends you unless they tell you to. Okay, I'm promoting a book. These are the questions I'd like to get asked. I probably wouldn't even have that person on because I don't just want to talk about your book because that's not necessarily valuable to my audience, but that's a personal thing. So just beware of that. Beware of the fact that if you're having someone on and you're just ripping off questions that they give you, it's not going to make for the best interview. Where was I going before I went on that rant? So yeah, I would say if you can set it up in some sort of Google, I don't know what it is, a Google Doc, I think it's some sort of Google Doc. You can literally have questions. They can upload their headshot. They can do all that stuff. Another thing too, don't let your guests name your episodes. If you let your guests name your episodes, you are definitely giving up growth opportunities. Your guest does not know your audience as well as you do. They have no idea who your audience is, most likely, unless they do research, and even then, they can't really know. You know your audience better than they do. You name the episode. One of the things that always throws me off is when I'm on a show and they say, well, what do you want the name of this episode to be? We haven't even done it yet. So I don't really know unless you're going to only ask me certain questions about vulnerability or peak performance or what podcasting, whatever it is. I don't know. I always tell them, I would suggest you write the title because you know your audience way better than I do. I can help you come up with the title, but it shouldn't come from me. It should come from you. So those are just a couple of small mistakes I see when I'm on the other end of a podcast and being interviewed. I would say this would be kind of the wrap up, the summary of it. Remove the safety net. If you're just starting and that helps you feel comfortable and you wouldn't do the interview without the pre-call, do it. But don't just rely on that forever, because eventually you might be able to systematize it in a certain way, or you might just be able to do research. And when you do research, I'm telling you, that impresses people. That impresses guests that you're having on, because if they've been on a lot of shows, they haven't had a lot of people do a lot of deep research. That's always blown me away. Those are the people I remember. Those are the people that I check in on because I remember them. It's a memorable experience for me. And it's not always about what's in it for you. A guest is coming on to help you, and it's to help them, of course. But if you can impress them, you never know what might happen. That's a potential collaboration in the future, all of that stuff. And vice versa on all this. This is why it's important for you as a podcast host to go on shows, because you're going to meet people you never would have. You're going to get opportunities you may never have before. You can see what you like in terms of being interviewed, and then maybe you can bring that over to your side and then use that when you're interviewing other people. You can see what works. You can see what doesn't, that type of stuff. Anything else I should add on this? What are we, 12 minutes in. No, I'll do a full episode later on more interview mistakes I see. Let me mark that down. Just because I don't want this to be too far all over the place. Mistakes. But if you think it's worth your time and it gives you a level of comfort that you wouldn't have otherwise, I think you do it. But eventually you're going to get to the place where some people are going to say no, and it doesn't mean they wouldn't be good fits, right? It doesn't mean that. I'm kind of weird in this, I think, where if somebody wants to do a pre-call, I'm all for it. If it's their second episode, I'm all for it. I love podcasting and I want to add as much value as possible. And that means choosing every show that reaches out and pretty much saying yes, as long as it's aligned in terms of the content. I love podcasters. I want to help podcasters. I want to meet podcasters. I want to practice my craft. I want to go on as many shows as aligned, but I know not everybody's like that. I've worked with clients who they wouldn't do a pre-call. If you wanted them on your show and you said, yeah, we have to do a 30-minute pre-call or a 15-minute pre-call, they wouldn't do it. They would say, well, I'm busy. I don't have that kind of time. I'm just going to go find a show that doesn't require that. So it's just something to think about. But it's the fine line between doing something you're super uncomfortable doing and just showing up and meeting a stranger and relying on that forever. How do we use it in a constructive way and not something that's ultimately going to hold us back? So that is what I would say about that. Should you do pre-calls before guest interviews? If you want to in the beginning to build some momentum and some comfort, do it. But eventually, it probably will not serve you as much. And the way you do it is going to matter too. If you really want to really get to know someone and have a deep conversation, awesome. But the majority of the ones that I've been on, they've been like 15 minutes. Tell me about yourself. What's your experience? What do you like to talk about? Is anything off limits? That type of stuff. When they could very easily find that on any of the podcasts I've been on or our own podcast. So just a thought. Just a thought. If you are struggling with your podcast in any way, shape, or form, and you're looking for a little advice, free advice, my link for a free 30-minute podcast breakthrough session will be in the show notes. As always, whatever it is, artwork, rebranding, titling episodes, looking through the data, whatever it may be, I am happy to talk to you about it. Monetization, whatever, wherever it is. I tend to do really well with questions. So when people hop on Zoom with me and they have a list of questions, that's like my favorite thing in the world. And there are no such thing as dumb questions. I promise. I've been asked many, many, many questions, and any question that adds value is a valuable question. So there are no dumb questions. Link will be in the show notes as always. All right, next week for episode number 93. It's not about the one thing that makes the difference. I had a call with a client recently, and this client has many, many episodes. They're 350 something episodes in. And their listens were at a peak probably about 6 months ago, and they started to trend down. And this person was kind of frustrated and kind of sad about it. So we had a really good, heart-driven, vulnerable conversation. So I want to share what was going on in my mind, what was going on in their mind, and then kind of what we came to in terms of an understanding, I guess, conflict, a resolution. And what do we come to in terms of a resolution? So we will talk about that next week. As always, I hope your guests are all saying yes. I hope you're able to elevate the credibility of the guests that you're getting on your show. I hope you're sticking with all the habits that have been working and being very honest about how much time, energy, effort, and focus you have to put in. And I hope you're getting new listeners and new subscribers and new reviews, most of all. Until next week, keep on crushing it, keep on podcasting, and we will talk to you